When the prosecution finished with their charges, a voice was heard saying, "Socrates, stand up and defend yourself." 2 men stood up. One was Xenophon's Socrates, a foolish and arrogant old man, and the other was Plato's Socrates, a little less foolish and arrogant old man. The first one called himself the wisest among Athenians, and the second one called himself also the wisest among Athenians, but only because he knows that he knows nothing. The year was 399 BC, and Athens, the most glorious city in all of the Greek world, beacon of democracy, held a trial against a scruffy 70-year-old corrupter of youth. Maybe it was just one Socrates that stood up that day to defend himself, a wise old man who truly was not afraid to die and wanted to answer these trumped-up charges with irony and irreverence. We are being facetious. There is more in Plato's apology than arrogance and irony, but consider this: Socrates was found guilty by around 280 to 220 votes. For such a margin, when death penalty was a possibility, the defendant had a right to propose a suitable punishment. It is believed that if Socrates had proposed exile, he would have gotten it. This is what Socrates proposed instead. "Some good thing, men of Athens, if I must propose something truly in accordance with my deserts, and the good thing should be such as is fitting for me. Now, what is fitting for a poor man who is your benefactor, and who needs leisure to exhort you? There is nothing, men of Athens, so fitting as that such a man be given his meals in the Prytaneon. That is much more appropriate for me than for any of you, who has won a race at the Olympic Games with a pair of horses. For he makes you seem to be happy, whereas I make you happy in reality, and he is not at all in need of sustenance, but I am needy. So if I must make a just assessment of what I deserve, I assess it as this: free meals in the Prytaneum." We shall never know, but at least one of the 500 jurors must have thought to himself, "How does this old man manage to walk with such testicular magnitude?" It is hard to find the man and even a philosopher in the sources we have about Socrates, of which there are 3, Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. As you may have noticed, Socrates himself is not among the sources. That's because he didn't write anything. All we know about him are from these 3 men, and each of them paints a different picture. There are some found fragments from other authors, but they are too insignificant to be useful. This difficulty in assessing real Socrates and his philosophy is called the Socratic problem. Aristophanes was a playwright who wrote about Socrates in his comedy The Clouds. Socrates is depicted as the head of a thinkery, an institute for teaching philosophy, which teaches its students various unconventional ideas and practices. Aristophanes portrays Socrates as an eccentric and absurd character, a fraud and a sophist. It is a caricature of the man, but certain qualities depicted here do correspond to Plato's Socrates: asceticism, disciplined, introverted thinking, and conversational dialectic. Of course, while Aristophanes makes fun of them, Plato views them with admiration. It is interesting to note that the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, one of the earliest thinkers who grappled with the Socratic problem, thought that Aristophanes' portrayal of Socrates in The Clouds was the most accurate, because it captured the subtleties of Socratic irony, while Xenophon and Plato took him too seriously. Xenophon, like Plato, wrote about Socrates in the form of Socratic dialogue, a genre in which a discussion of moral and philosophical problems between 2 or more individuals is based on asking and answering questions. A Socratic method intended to bring out inadequacies and inconsistencies in interlocutors' beliefs, resulting in aporia, a state of puzzlement, doubt, and impasse. Basically, Socrates barrages his interlocutors with questions until they realize they know nothing, and from there they can begin to search for the truth. Xenophon's depiction of Socrates as philosopher is largely rejected as it is considered that he, being a soldier, was not in the best position to express Socratic ideas effectively, and portrays a rather uninspiring philosopher. When depicting the trial of Socrates in his Apology, he is of course biased towards his former friend and teacher, whom he considers unjustly sentenced. Socrates is portrayed as extremely arrogant, but I guess Xenophon doesn't see it that way. Socrates says that his whole life has been spent wholly and justly, that he is honored by divine powers and is guided by the voice of God. He asks the jurors if they know anyone less enslaved to the appetites of the body, anyone more independent or just or wise. Is it not obvious that the praise he gets from gods and men is justly earned? Apology is also touching at times. This is how Xenophon ends it. For myself indeed, as I lay to mind the wisdom of the man and his nobility, I can neither forget him, nor, remembering him, forbear to praise him. But if any of those who make virtue their pursuit have ever met a more helpful friend than Socrates, I tender such a one. My congratulations as a most enviable man. Then there is Plato. The problem with Plato's Socrates is that we find two of him. The philosopher could assert a certain idea in one dialogue, but later challenge or contradict it in another. Such inconsistencies prompted Plato scholars to distinguish between his early and later dialogues. In the early dialogues, Socrates' primary focus is on challenging his opponent's arguments, rather than presenting his own ideas. His fundamental stance is, I know that I know nothing. That changes in the later dialogues. Socrates begins to know more and more and to offer solutions. In the famous Republic, he has developed the whole philosophy of how an ideal society should be organized. Some scholars think that Socrates, from early Plato's dialogues, is closest to the historic one. The presumption is that Plato at first tried to faithfully represent his teacher, and later, as he developed his own philosophy, he used Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. Some say that he is only present in Plato's Apology, while others think that the only thing we know about Socrates with certainty is that we don't know anything. He was the rock on which the Western philosophy built its church, and we hardly knew him. What we can assess of his life, this is how it went. He was born around 470 BC to a stonemason and a midwife. He probably learned stonemasonry from his father and worked as a sculptor for a time. He inherited some of his father's estate, which gave him some financial stability. When he was around 40, he fought with distinction in several campaigns in the Peloponnesian War. In one of those campaigns, he saved the life of notorious Alcibiades. He was married twice and had 3 sons. After the war, we find him roaming the streets of Athens, engaging anyone willing to talk. He earned a following, and many of his pupils were wealthy and prominent Athenian citizens. In 399 BC, he stood trial for impiety and the corruption of the youth. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by poison. While in prison, awaiting his cup of poison hemlock, his friends and followers offered to help him escape. He refused and drank the hemlock. This is the description of his last moments in Plato's Phaedo. He walked around, and when he had said his legs were heavy, he lay on his back as he had been told to do, and the man who had given him the poison touched his body, and after a while tested his feet and legs, pressed hard upon his foot, and asked him if he felt this, and Socrates said no. Then he pressed his calves, and made his way up his body, and showed that it was cold and stiff. He felt it himself, and said that when the cold reached his heart he would be gone. As his belly was getting cold, Socrates uncovered his head and said, these were his last words, Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering to him, and do not forget. It shall be done, said Crito. Tell us if there is anything else. But there was no answer. Shortly afterwards, Socrates made a movement. The man uncovered him, and his eyes were fixed. Seeing this, Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. At the time of Socrates' trial, Athens was at the tail end of a politically very turbulent time. Just 5 years earlier, they had lost the Peloponnesian War. After Sparta destroyed its navy in 405 BC and then besieged the city, finally in March of 404 BC, Athens surrendered. Spartans then installed an oligarchic government that became known as the 30 Tyrants. Their leader was a man called Critias, a student of Socrates. During their reign, they executed 5% of the Athenian population. Many were exiled and their property confiscated. Socrates was not one of them. Reign of the 30 Tyrants lasted 8 months. The group of exiles managed to organize an uprising and overthrew the regime. In order to reconcile and rebuild the democratic city, amnesty was given to everybody except the 30 themselves. Because Socrates stayed in the city during their rule, it is possible that the public associated him with the tyrants, and that fact may have played a part in his trial. In Plato's Apology, Socrates describes to the court how he, along with 4 other men, was ordered by the 30 to bring a man he thought of as just for execution. He says, "On this occasion, however, I again made it clear, not by my words but by my actions, that the attention I paid to death was 0, if that is not too unrefined a claim, but that I gave all my attention to avoiding doing anything unjust or unholy. Powerful as it was, that government did not terrify me into doing a wrong action. When we came out of the rotunda, the other 4 went to Salamis and arrested Leon, but I simply went home." While the charges against Socrates were impiety and corruption of youth, it is impossible to categorically deny that political reasons might have played a part in his prosecution. 2,400 years have passed since a shabby-looking man who rarely bathed walked the streets of the ancient city and questioned everything and everyone. It is hard from such a distance to define a man and a thinker who left no writings of his own, but the method of questioning everything that carries his name has shaped our civilization through centuries. In the case of People versus Socrates, prosecution is withdrawing its charges. Socrates, you are free to go, and the lunch is on us.